pleasurable. People enjoy listening to stories, going to the cinema, dancing a tango, just as much as storytellers, filmmakers, choreographers enjoy creating their work. It's also true that cultural activity is pleasurable. Creating and sharing a special meal is a meaningful experience. Where art starts to differentiate itself from the broader field of human culture, where it starts to acquire a distinctive character and function, is in the degree of the self-consciousness with which it engages with meanings and values. It uses sophisticated techniques, symbolism, metaphor, allegory, to produce intellectual and emotional effects through which it aims to communicate ideas, values, feelings. Its non-rational methods, even when obscured as they are today in an apparently rationalistic world, are powerful and can produce transformative results. Perhaps most importantly, art can question, reimagine, undermine, critique, and dream about existing values and meanings. Art is a toolbox that enables human beings to interfere with their culture. It allows us to become more conscious of the cultural values that shape our thinking and behaviour, and as a result, to question, to change, and to grow. We don't think or live like our grandparents because of the changes that art has produced in our imaginations and sensibility. And I make no distinction here between high art and low art or different forms. Now clearly, that's a big claim and it requires some justification. You could as easily argue that it's the extraordinary technological changes that mean that we don't live like our grandparents. The invention of telecommunications, flight, antibiotics has had a transformative effect on human life, of course, but it's the imagination expressed through art that has made those experiences meaningful to us. The car is a fantastically useful tool, but its hold on the Western imagination through film and music has nothing to do with its practicality. We may be born to run, racing in the street or a wreck on the highway, but we dream our modernity in the exhaust fumes of the internal combustion engine. And those dreams have physical consequences. The numbers of cars in China doubled in the last 5 years. One estimate suggests that in the next 30 years, there will be nearly 3 billion cars in the world, compared to about 500 million today. That's the power of our dreams. Human inventiveness has brought equally profound, though perhaps more sustainable changes in art itself. The discovery of photography was a remarkable scientific achievement, but its impact on our visual sense depended on artists reacting to the new medium, both by creating a language for it and by imagining the existing visual language of painting to take it along paths that photography could not follow. The invention of the novel, itself made possible by the coincidence of a growing educated readership with disposable income and industrial methods of production and distribution and marketing, had the consequence of making visible, most obviously here in the work of Charles Dickens, millions of poor, marginalised or exploited people who had barely figured in art before the 19th century. And not merely visible, but imaginable human individuals capable of generating empathy. The impact of Tiny Tim and Oliver Twist on Dickens' readers was profound and contributed to the social changes of the Victorian period. More recently, Willy Loman, Atticus Finch and Tom Joad changed America as much as 100 senators. And here's another counterintuitive proposal. Those texts have influenced more people who have not read them than they have changed those who have. Indeed, I chose them because I have never read Death of a Salesman, To Kill a Mockingbird, or The Grapes of Wrath. Even so, those texts create characters that have independent experiences, living in and influencing the minds of millions who've never encountered them directly. The French critic Pierre Bayard created a storm recently when he published a book, How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read, which, as you can see, is a perfectly straightforward thing to do. I've put the covers of both versions of the book because the French book has an important question mark at the end of it. He's asking a question: how do we talk about the books that we haven't read? The English, being very practical, turned it into a kind of self-help manual. What Bayard is trying to say is that we have a complex relationship with books and with culture more generally. He divides all books into those he's never heard of, those he's skimmed through, those he knows about but hasn't read, and those he's forgotten. It's really brave for a professor of French literature to admit having only ever skimmed Proust or Valéry, or, as he does, having forgotten one of his own books. But it's also true and liberating. It's what our experience of culture is like. Because our experience of art and culture is not like ticking off achievements in the Observer's Book of Art. It's a relationship which changes and evolves all the time. What Bayard wants us to do is to talk about art. And his book concludes, the last sentence of his book says, all teaching should work towards helping those receiving it to gain sufficient freedom in relation to works of art to become themselves writers or artists. In other words, he wants us to be confident, to talk about books, to talk about our cultural experiences, whatever they have been. We can talk about Hamlet, we can talk about Sherlock Holmes, whether we have ever seen Hamlet or read a Sherlock Holmes book. Today, fiction continues to enable us to think and talk about aspects of our lives that we find hardest to approach directly. John Sutherland argues, for example, that what he calls grown-up discussion of race is now rare, except in novels such as Andrea Levy's Small Island, Roth's The Human Stain, Zadie Smith's On Beauty. He maintains that outside fiction, race is such a hot-button issue that politicians and the press will handle it only with pious platitudes and hobbled correctness. Art avoids being fenced in by pious platitudes and hobbled correctness for two reasons. The more obvious, but less important, is that since the late 19th century, Western societies have come to accept the concept of art as transgressive, even confrontational. The artist came to be seen as the courageous innovator, leading the way towards new and, it was always believed in modernist terms, better ways of feeling, seeing and being. Misunderstood, reviled in their day, artists are vindicated when the rest of society catches up, perhaps as in the emblematic case of Vincent van Gogh after they're dead. How many artists secretly believe that they will be discovered when they're dead? So art today has a license to provoke, at least among Western liberal democracies, though there are limits to that, both within those democracies and in their international relations. Internally, some issues of sexuality, drugs or religion remain dangerously off limits, as artists such as Nan Golding or Robert Mapplethorpe have found. In the wider context, since the collapse of communism as a global ideological force, faith has often become the frontier on which different value systems, different cultures, different meanings have confronted each other. Most obviously with Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses, or the cartoons of Muhammad published by the Danish newspapers Jyllands-Posten in September 2005. But the second reason why art can open up new or difficult ideas is older and more universal than this modernist concept of licensed transgression. It's the essential ambiguity of art. We don't know what is happening, and yet we do. Whereas in much formal communication, and most obviously in law, human beings strive to achieve a single clear expression, art embraces the possibility of multiple interpretations. It's an active dialogue between creator and receiver in which neither has complete control. There are limits beyond which an interpretation is simply perverse and won't attract any, won't be persuasive. But an artist cannot determine how a reader, a listener, a spectator will respond to their work. Artworks are not static holders of meaning. They are recreated in every encounter. Alberto Manguel writes, "It's the reader who reads the sense. It's the reader who grants or recognizes an object, place, or event, even the possibility of readability. It is the reader who must attribute meaning to a system of signs and then decipher it." However many hours I put into this talk, it's impossible for me to control what you will think of it. Some of you will like it, some of you will not like it, some of you will think of it, things that I had no intention that you would think of it. Both sides of the exchange enabled in a work of art are creative. But, whereas in law the impossibility of reaching a definitive meaning can be catastrophic, in art it's essential and liberating. It allows artists safely to imagine possibilities, and it allows us, as the readers, the listeners, the spectators, equally safely to imagine interpretations, to create meanings or to advocate values that might be censored if they were expressed unambiguously. It allows audiences the same freedom of interpretation. Deniability is everything. Take the life of Shostakovich. It illustrates it perfectly, not least because as a composer of classical music, it centres on the completely abstract nature of instrumental music. As a Soviet citizen and artist, Shostakovich worked under the constant threat that the state would take offence at his music. Twice he was denounced and feared imminent arrest. Today, 40 years after his death and 20 years after the fall of communism, people who have no experience of the life and the society that he lives still argue about whether he was an artist who compromised with state terror or who bravely resisted it through the subtle messages of his music. And that despite the obvious reality that his music is abstract, whatever it communicates cannot be proven. As Dylan once said, when asked what his music were about, some are about 4 minutes, some are about 5 minutes, and some, believe it or not, were about 11 or 12. We talk about the difficulty of defining art as if it's a problem. Actually, it's the best thing about it. Since you can't ever define what a work of art is, you can't kill it. You can't put it in a box and close it off.